Good evening or afternoon, kind of depending on where you are. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you to tonight's class on Arthur Szyk. This is the second class in our series commemorating Szyk's 130th birthday. So here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually, and we hope that if you are able to, you will join the museum, you will visit the museum, in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act Rescue in Denmark, which is the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. You can learn more and get tickets on our website. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Closed captions are also available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. Today, we are so honored to be joined again by Irvin Ungar. Irvin is the world's foremost expert on the art of Arthur Szyk and the tireless force behind the Szyk Renaissance. A former pulpit rabbi fluent in Jewish history and tradition, Irvin is the CEO and founder of Historicana, an antiquarian book firm and small publishing house of Szyk imprints. Beginning in 1987, Irvin first specialized in Szyk's remarkable illustrated books and quickly expanded his repertoire to include original art, fine art prints, and other important Szyk works. He has curated and consulted for numerous Szyk exhibitions at major institutions worldwide. He is also the author of Arthur Szyk's Soldier in Art, which won the National Jewish Book Award in 2017, and Justice Illuminated: The Art of Arthur Szyk. His most recent book, Arthur Szyk Preserved: Institutional Collections of Original Art, was published in 2023. Additionally, Irvin is the co-producer of the documentary film Soldier in Art, Arthur Szyk, and the publisher of the luxury limited edition of the Szyk Haggadah. He also served as the curator of the Arthur Szyk Society and his traveling exhibition program, and continues lecturing and speaking about Szyk on university campuses, museums, and other venues around the world. Irvin's memoirs on his life with Arthur Szyk have been accepted by a major university press and will be forthcoming. You can buy a number of Irvin's books at the museum bookstore at the link in the chat. So I want to thank you all so much for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to Irvin.
Okay, I'm going to share the screen.
Yes.
Let's do that properly. Okay, I hope that has...
through clearly.
Okay, wonderful. So let's just move this up here. Good evening, everyone. It's nice to be back for a second of my 4 talks. And thank you, Sydney, again for your introduction. And welcome, everyone, to the fabric of America through the art of Arthur Szyk. In January 1941, with the free world facing a belligerent Germany, Russia, and Japan, President Franklin Roosevelt delivered his famous State of the Union for Freedom speech. At the time of the speech, a series of 38 paintings dedicated to freedom, entitled Washington and His Times, commemorating George Washington, the American Revolution, and freedom from fear and tyranny. These 38 paintings were hanging in the White House. And who was the creator of these inspirational works of art displayed not far from the presidential Oval Office? Arthur Szyk. And when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, whose art was on the cover of Time magazine, showing Admiral Yamamoto as the aggressor? Arthur Szyk. And when the war was in full swing, whose artwork was exhibited more than 500, yes, 500 USO recreation centers, and seen by more than 1 million GIs heading overseas? Arthur Szyk. And whose art during the war years was more regularly seen on the covers and within the pages of the New York Times Book Review? Arthur Szyk. To understand the power of Szyk's art in America, it's important to first establish how well known he was and how widely recognizable was his art. While this presentation is titled The Fabric of America Through the Art of Arthur Szyk, it is safe to say that he was an essential part himself of America's fabric. And as such, it is clear that he effectively and affectionately wove himself into the hearts and minds of millions of people across this country. Let me present a hypothetical day in New York City in the 1940s to give you an idea of just how omnipresent Szyk was. Suppose you wake up one morning in your New York apartment, are drinking your coffee along with your bagel and cream cheese while reading the New York Post with Szyk as its featured political artist. And there in front of you, a Szyk black and white political cartoon grabs your attention. Here, a sampling of what you might see on any particular day. After that, you need to make a few telephone calls, and you reach for your Manhattan telephone directory, and there on its cover is a Szyk illustration. For your afternoon activity, you decide to visit a prominent New York art gallery, for after all, New York is the center of the art world at that time. Picasso's art is not being exhibited at Wildenstein's or Knoedler's galleries that week, but that's okay. Arthur Szyk is being shown. And then, following an inspiring visit to discover Szyk up close, you return to your apartment to catch up on correspondence. You reach for poster stamps to affix to your envelopes for mailing. And in your desk drawer are numerous Szyk designs to choose from. Selecting this afternoon one of his 4 freedom stamps, perhaps freedom from want. At this point, realizing you hadn't eaten much that day and you want a hot dog and orange soda, you set off for Nedick's in Times Square. As you're about to enter the restaurant, you realize that after a long day, your neck and back need stretching. Tilting backward and looking up, in the very center of visitors' heaven at 7th Avenue and 42nd Street, you see an enormous billboard of Abraham Lincoln, pictured with the opening lines of his second inaugural address, drawn by none other than Arthur Szyk. And after a quick dinner, you decide to catch a Broadway musical. And glancing around, you see legendary producer Mike Todd's latest show stretching before your eyes above the Winter Garden. And you are drawn in by the large advertisement of As the Girls Go, illustrated by Arthur Szyk. And that, my friends, is a typical day in New York City with Mr. Szyk. He is everywhere in the heart of America, an undeniable, visible part of its fabric. And honestly, it's quite an exhausting day. And were this not enough, to affirm Szyk's visibility and connectivity to the American public, consider that while Norman Rockwell was illustrating the covers of the Saturday Evening Post, Szyk was illustrating the covers of Collier's magazine. And just how widely circulated was the Saturday Evening Post with Rockwell covers? 3 million copies. And how many each of Collier's cover with Szyk art were printed? 2.5 million. Everyone who saw Rockwell saw Arthur Szyk. And yet, dare I say that more people saw Szyk than saw Rockwell, particularly those fighting for our country. While I referenced earlier the 500 USO recreation centers exhibiting his art, Esquire magazine conducted a survey reporting that Szyk's art was more popular with US servicemen than were pictures of pinup girls. Imagine. And virtually every major US military base exhibited his art, and several added it to their museum's permanent collections. Szyk received hundreds of letters from GIs abroad requesting his cartoons for moral support. One soldier writing, as attested to by this clipping from Szyk's personal scrapbook, "Keep it up." Among those in the US government who knew or communicated with Szyk, just to name 4, or such varied national figures as General Douglas MacArthur, whose portrait appeared full page in Esquire magazine during the war, and Eleanor Roosevelt, seen here with Szyk signing stamps that he created as a fundraiser for the British American Ambulance Corps, and Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor under FDR and the first woman cabinet member to whom Szyk called attention with this illustrated portrait for Fortune magazine, and father of the esteemed former Museum of Jewish Heritage president and board chair Robert M. Morgenthau, that is, Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau Jr., shown here with his inscribed photograph to Arthur Szyk. It was Secretary Morgenthau Jr. who was the initiator of the war bonds program to help finance the war, and for whom Szyk drew, as a $1 a year man, numerous magazine, newspaper, and poster ads for the war effort. Hence, in a very direct way, we see Szyk's connection through Morgenthau Jr. to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, for which I have the privilege of speaking tonight. So just when and how did Arthur Szyk, a Jew living in central Poland and later France, become so entwined with the history of America before visiting its shores? And how did he become such an active and integral participant in its unfolding 20th century drama? Let's back up a bit to 1920s Paris, where Szyk settled following his World War I military service in Poland. After several successful one-man art exhibitions and illustrating some of the French capital's most exquisite and expensive fine art books, his attention turned in 1926 to what I believe is one of the greatest illuminated manuscripts of the 20th century, rivaling his Haggadah, the Statute of Kalish, which is housed at the Jewish Museum in New York City. It was in its 45 illuminated pages, drawing attention to Jewish emancipation and the enactment of several civil and religious privileges for the Jews of 13th century Poland, that Szyk first drew American symbols and historic figures. Here, Poles who were participants and supporters in the fight for American freedom are shown. Kazimierz Pulaski, who played a key role as cavalry officer in the American Revolution, and the Polish Jew, Chaim Solomon, financial broker for the Continental Army, both accompanied with a shield of the American flag. At the time that Szyk was finishing up his Statute of Kalish in Paris, he had already begun sketching out images of Native Americans and British and American officers and soldiers for a fully American work of art, his 38 illuminated leaves for Washington and his Times, which I mentioned at the beginning and which hung in the White House. Not only was this portfolio created to commemorate America's independence, coinciding with the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth, but it expressed Szyk's concern about racial equality in the United States. Here, Szyk calls attention to the sacrifice a Black man made in fighting for Americans' liberty at a time when Blacks themselves were not free, as a fallen Prince Estabrook is highlighted in a pink jacket front and center, lest the viewer not clearly see the not so subtle message that Szyk wants to deliver about another struggle for that of racial equality. How incredible is it then that in 1932, that the Statute of Kalish and Washington and his Times, both important works by a Jew highlighting freedom, are printed in Munich and Vienna respectively. Ironically, two of the most anti-Semitic cities in Europe on the eve of Hitler coming to power. How even more incredible is it that Szyk is invited by members of the United States Congress to come to America in 1933 and exhibit these freedom works at the Library of Congress. As part of this celebratory event for his artwork, Szyk was presented with the George Washington Bicentennial Medal by the United States in honor of his works on behalf of humanity in the pursuit of freedom and justice. And while in America, for 7 months, Szyk's statute was viewed as the Magna Carta of the Jewish people, and numerous efforts were made by the Federation of Polish Jews in America to use it to create a closer connection between Polish Jews and American Jews, and between American Jews and Poland. Efforts were also made by the American Polish Jewish Magna Carta Committee, headed by the notable antiquarian Dr. A.S.W. Rosenbach, to raise funds for the purchase of Szyk's statute for the Polish government as a gesture of goodwill on behalf of Polish Jewry. Fundraising banquets were held, and Szyk was constantly being honored. As an aside, there is no question that seeds were being sown by Szyk in terms of developing beneficial relationships that would serve him during his eventual return to America for good some 6 years later. Meanwhile, in 1934, Szyk went back to Poland and devoted almost 3 years on illuminating his masterwork on freedom, the Haggadah. And during this time, the original art of his Washington and his Times portfolio was purchased from him in 1935 by the President of Poland, Ignacy Mościcki, who in turn presented it to the President of the United States as a gift for the American people from the people of Poland. What is clear is that just as Arthur Szyk's art of the statutes was to serve as a bridge between Jews and Poland, his Washington and his Times was to similarly serve as a bridge between the people of America and Poland. In other words, to create closer relations between two countries, two peoples, on the eve of World War II. In an effort to further this relationship, after moving from Poland to London in 1937 to publish the Haggadah, he also devoted himself to creating a group of paintings entitled the Polish-American Fraternity. This series, consisting of 23 original works of art, were exhibited in the Polish Pavilion at New York's World's Fair in Flushing Meadows, Queens, in 1939, in an attempt to emphasize the contributions that Poles had made to the history of the United States since the time of the American Revolution and before. This was yet again an example of Szyk using his art to advance closer kinship by the United States with Poland in the face of Nazi aggression spreading in Central Europe in 1938 and 1939. And while on exhibit, World War II broke out on September 1st, 1939. In 1940, Arthur Szyk immigrated to America from England with his wife and daughter, while his son George remained behind in Europe to fight with the Free French under General Charles de Gaulle. More about how and who supported Szyk's coming to the US will be discussed in my next lecture. Upon his arrival, Szyk is reported to have said, "At last I have found the home that I have always searched for. Here I can speak of what my soul feels. There is no other place on earth that gives one the freedom, liberty, and justice that America does." And while he arrived, prepared to serve as a fighting artist for the preservation of that freedom and liberty on both sides of the Atlantic, and while he saw the fabric of America sown as a land of opportunity and advancement, he was well aware of its shortcomings, as witnessed in its isolationism, its anti-immigration policy, its racism, and its anti-Semitism. Let me attempt, then, to present Szyk's concerns within his art, which advocated for the war effort abroad, yet simultaneously addressed battles of another kind on the home front. In a sense, we will try to frame before us images of two simultaneous strands of thought, two Szyk points of attack, the war abroad and the war at home, within a single lens at the same time. Let us start with America's isolationism. Szyk arrives in an America not yet in the war, but with a clear mission to persuade it to engage as vigorously and as early as possible. Toward that end, the isolationist and anti-Semite famed aviator Charles Lindbergh becomes a target of Szyk, as seen in these two images drawn by him for the American Mercury magazine. Szyk does not stop with Lindbergh, but courageously takes on isolationist congressional advocates, such as Iowa Senator Gerald P. Nye, and national leaders, such as the president of United Mine Workers of America, John L. Lewis. Ironically, the American Mercury, which was the first magazine in America to contract with Szyk for a series of his drawings, beginning with their appearance in September of 1941, was founded by the notable American linguist H.L. Mencken, whose diaries later revealed his dark side as a virulent anti-Semite with pro-Nazi sympathies. Having resigned from the American Mercury in 1933 as its editor, coinciding with the year that Hitler came to power, one wonders what he might have thought of the Jew Szyk attacking his own fellow co-conspirators from within the very magazine that he founded. Let us now turn to the dark side of immigration, but with a twist. It is, at the outset, important to acknowledge the catastrophic story of America and Roosevelt's refusing to accept Jewish refugees, such as those on the passenger ship St. Louis, as well as the narrative truth of the unfilled immigration quotas that would have allowed for European Jews to have secured safety in the United States. And to be sure, Szyk, in collaboration with Hollywood screenwriter turned activist Ben Hecht, attacked the US State Department and its pervasive anti-Semitism, preventing Jews from immigrating to the US. I will elaborate on this further, much more in my next lecture as part of my establishing Szyk as the leading artist for the rescue of European Jewry in America during World War II. But here, I wish to reference Arthur Szyk's personal immigrant experience within the context of his fighting on behalf of America, while sticking to a somewhat chronological flow of Szyk's advancement in those efforts. At the same time, in September 1941, that his pen and ink line drawings began to appear in the American Mercury, he was working on provocative and stirring, elaborate and colorful paintings for reproduction for Collier's magazine, the likes of which had never before been seen on its covers. It is to Szyk's very first cover for Collier's that I'd like to call your attention, and to spend some time actually, and then his written response to it from an immigrant's perspective. Here we see an historic poker game between Germany's Hitler and Ivan of Russia. Ivan, a name representing Russia, as the names Uncle Sam and John Bull have come to symbolize the US and Great Britain. As an aside, it's a picture my father, a poker-playing GI, would have loved had he seen it or lived long enough to see me acquire it and to write about it. Dad played in many a card game overseas, and decades later, in 1987, won the World Series of Poker. So there is no question it would have been his favorite Szyk work of art, which makes it therefore one of mine as well. It is the creation of this artwork and its subsequent publication that relates to Szyk's immigrant experience, but with a twist, as I mentioned earlier. First the image, and then his response. Let me say that this is the only Szyk artwork that I've ever encountered for which he himself wrote a description or discussed its significance. The setting, for this poker game is approximately 3 months after June 22nd, 1941, the date on which Hitler launched a surprise attack against the Soviet Union, breaking their non-aggression treaty toward each other. Szyk visualized this as two rivals facing off in an historic poker game. Here, Ivan holds two cards, a pair of aces, his allies of America and Great Britain. Hitler holds three jokers, his Axis partners of Mussolini of Italy, Pétain of the Vichy French, and Hirohito of Japan. And though three of a kind would always beat two of a kind, as you poker players who are listening know, Szyk is optimistic that Ivan, with the pair, has the winning hand, as evidenced by the artist placing a larger stack of chips in front of the Russian. Why? Because no one knows what jokers or wild cards will do. But a pair of aces, that's real strength. And meanwhile, Hitler's acolyte puppets of Nazi sympathizers are strung along, and death, dressed in the upper right in unblemished military garb, will be the only victor coming away clean in this confrontation. At the time that I first studied this cover, while holding the magazine in my hands, a piece of paper fell out from inside its pages. Not once have I ever come across another like it in another copy of this magazine issue, nor anywhere in my research. It turns out that this broadsheet, written by Szyk and printed in red ink to accompany this issue of the magazine, not only provided his description of the artwork, but did something more. It is here that Szyk spoke of what his art's appearance in Collier's meant to him personally, indicating how proud he was to be an immigrant in America. Using the word privilege 3 times in his text, he states at the end of paragraph 2, "It is my privilege as an artist to have drawn this cover. I wonder if you realize just how great a privilege it is." He goes on to speak in paragraph 3 about being an exile from Lodz, then in German hands, and his son serving under de Gaulle, thus feeling how close the war is to him. He further sees himself as a future American in the last paragraph, with the conviction that, as he writes at the end, the only hope for the future of the world lies in the Anglo-Saxon democracies. He concludes, "I am proud to see my work on the cover of Collier's. It's a real privilege." Thus, my chosen emphasis, the twist, if you will, or focus, if you will, on Szyk as an immigrant, indeed, among the very few immigrant political artists of his status and aware of his own status in the US, if not the only one to have firsthand experience of Nazism in Europe. Now, to tackling racism in America. I would like to begin by following up on my earlier reference in this talk to Szyk's 1930 painting in Paris of the Black Man, Prince Estabrook, who participated in the battles of Lexington and Concord, and America's struggle for liberty at a time when reportedly 90% of his fellow Blacks were themselves slaves. It is no surprise then that Szyk would have been more than sensitive to the racism he witnessed upon his arrival in the US. How ironic it is that the American armed forces, which would celebrate Szyk as a citizen soldier of the free world, and that he would dare speak out against that very military establishment in light of its policy of maintaining segregated units of Blacks and whites serving in separate units. And to this, Szyk responded with absolute clarity of conviction, unafraid to challenge the highest ranking officials in the land with his indignation. Here, Szyk has positioned a black GI and a white GI walking together, side by side, with their captured German prisoners in the background. His caption, the white soldier asks the black soldier, "And what would you do with Hitler?" The black responds, "I would have made him a Negro and dropped him somewhere in the USA." The most damning punishment a human being like Hitler should endure, according to this black soldier, as articulated by Szyk, would be to be enslaved by deadly racism in America. And here again is racial humiliation. A Nazi officer confronts his worst nightmare, capture by a black American soldier. Exhibited in art galleries in both New York and Philadelphia in 1944 and 1945, it is clear that this type of work was directed toward the conscience of a mostly white American audience in examining its own prejudices. As a somewhat sequel to this piece, and as a transition to Szyk's attention to anti-Semitism during 1940s America, he chose a Jew from Brooklyn to ease into his case, that in far too many circles, underlying attitudes towards the Jew at home were not much different than abroad. The Jew as an Untermensch. His caption at the top, "Taken prisoners by a Jewish fellow from Brooklyn. What a humiliation for us, the master race," calls attention to similarly held views by those in America who considered themselves the master race, such as anti-Semite far-right Catholic priest Father Charles Coughlin, to those of the soft left who led universities and social clubs and whose quotas saw the Jew as less than equal, and where its leaders were held captive by their own prejudice and racist attitudes towards the Jews. A pair of images focusing on the comments of the Nazis' chief propagandist, Joseph Goebbels, will perhaps hit a bit closer to home today. On the left, mimicking the famous scene from Shakespeare's Hamlet, Goebbels examines a human skull, questioning whether it looks Jewish or not, Aryan or non-Aryan. That is the question. Clearly, the pseudoscience of phrenology is employed here to determine not only who is a Jew, but to prove his inferiority. Szyk cautioning his American viewers to be careful in their own personal judgments of their fellow men. On the right, he warns all of us of a lie-mongering Goebbels truth. Anti-Semitic propaganda is the best softener of democracy. That anti-Semitism has the capacity to undermine democracy there and here, then and now. Amidst all of this, Szyk takes a stance against American Jews themselves, not doing enough to combat anti-Semitism here in the United States. In the present crisis, the American of Jewish descent has proved neither intelligent nor courageous. The anti-Semitic stories that are circulated in factories, the veiled attacks by small political groups, the spread of discrimination. I have seen these things happen throughout Europe. I've seen their roots take hold precisely this way in Poland and in Germany. The situation is dynamite, but you cannot get American Jews to recognize the seriousness of the parallel, nor learn a lesson from what has gone before. You would think that our Americans of Jewish descent would now press Congress with all the great influence they really possess to make this country's position clear with reference to the shocking things that are going on in Europe. You'd think they would not rest until laws were passed in this country outlawing anti-Semitic acts. For these acts are not merely hooliganism. They are organized murder, incitement to violence, and the first steps in fascist attempts to overthrow the democratic form of government. Arthur Szyk, July 5th, 1943. And still, with all of this going on with his own people, Szyk had time to donate art, raise money, and lend his support for the non-Jewish world, for the Chinese and the Czechs, displaced Poles and tattered Brits, the soldiers of Australia and New Zealand, as the letters of thanks and appreciation shown here poured into him from government representatives and NGOs from numerous nations. Representatives for the Greek cause, for example, Friends of Greece, would write, "We wish to thank you for your contribution, which represents to us more than money, since it is part of yourself that you have given to the Greek cause." A year later, Szyk made time to serve as the vice chairman of the Committee for the Rebirth of Distomo, the Greek town destroyed by the Nazis in June 1944. A closer look at this newspaper clipping provides insight into the intellectual circle and socially active, influential friends who surrounded and supported Szyk and his work. Eleanor Roosevelt, prominent congressional leaders, outstanding theater personalities, Helen Hayes and Lillian Hellman, in light of the Academy Awards last night, I mentioned their names, and acclaimed sculptor Joe Davidson. A talk on America and World War II would not be complete without drawing attention to Szyk's masterpiece of Satan Leads the Ball. Here, the darkest figures of the Axis are marching to the tune of Satan, the devil with horns in front, who holds in his hand the Nibelungen musical score of the anti-Semite Richard Wagner, from whom the Nazis drew inspiration. These are the followers of the disease of hatred, who parade in lockstep to the dance of death, whom Szyk, a hater of hate, fought with pen, brush, and venom as he attempted to enlist the masses in his moral crusade against evil. All of the marching figures are identifiable, but a few for now bear calling out. Behind Satan, Japanese military leader and Prime Minister Tojo, with his Mitsubishi inscribed scabbard. Hitler in the center, with propaganda minister Goebbels in front of him, holding a Jew as a Bolshevik boogie popping up as a jack in the box. And behind Hitler's head is Reich Marshal Hermann Göring. And to his left, toward the back of the pact, is the skeleton of death with a soldier's helmet. Behind it is Vichy head Philippe Pétain with white hair and white mustache. And below, in front of him, is Vichy Prime Minister Pierre Laval, holding a bag of 30 pieces of silver, a biblical reference to a betrayal of Jesus, here of the French betrayal of its Jews. In the top left corner, bringing up the rear, is the large woman figure of Germanica, Germany, or grotesque-like Wagnerian figure Brunhilde, on whose blue and red-edged robe is a Nazi slogan of Jude verrecht, death to the Jew. And last but not least, the true rear end, Mussolini at the bottom without any pants on. Concerning this artwork, it seems so fitting to dwell for a moment on Szyk's aesthetics. Here, Harvard art historian Professor James Kettlewell's words. In Satan Leads the Ball, we see Szyk at his most powerful and most perfect. First, the mask-like caricatures of the Axis hierarchy lash out at the observer's consciousness. And then, over time, that all great art requires, the observer begins to appreciate Szyk's fantastic composition like nothing seen before in art history. A closely packed array of interwoven forms, like a single moving organism, fills the surface from top to bottom and side to side. A Jackson Pollock drip painting could serve as its skeleton. A partly concealed rhythm of diagonals provides an aesthetic ordering to the expressive sense of chaos. Fragments of beautiful color sparkle across the surface, making this, like all of Szyk's art, an exquisite ornamental display. It was this exquisite ornamental display, combining Szyk's great art with the power to communicate compelling messages, that attracted so many American organizations and leading big businesses to him. Szyk was not only absorbed in fighting the disease of hatred, but was engaged in fighting against diseases of so many kinds. As an activist in the slaying of cancer for the American Cancer Society, in the advocacy of fighting against disasters in the service of providing emergency assistance and relief, and even fighting against venereal disease in the form of posters for the walls of the GI barracks overseas. Here, Fold the Axis, Use Prophylaxis, features a bulging-eyed Hitler identified across his chest as syphilis, a buck-toothed, though missing front teeth Tojo as chancroid, and a bare-tushied Mussolini, again without pants. In essence, if your enemies don't kill you, don't let venereal disease do you in, per this advertisement for a Philadelphia-based pharmaceutical company. As to the role of big business, fighting the enemy as well, Szyk was one of its leading visual communicators, illustrating ads for United States Steel, General Motors, Young and Rubicam, Philco Corporation, Lumbermen's Mutual Casualty Company, and even Coca-Cola, with the hope of bringing about peace in Palestine by implying that sharing Coke together equals Shalom Aleichem, peace be unto you. And here too, Szyk was everywhere as part of the fabric of the United States, using his art to appeal to the strength of corporate America and the best that it and the United States had to offer. As World War II came to an end, Szyk would focus on three things: returning to book illustration, the creation of the State of Israel, which I shall address in my next talk, and producing of his greatest Americana. But for Szyk, there would always be a balance when it came to the United States. He wore no blinders about its weaknesses, its deficiencies, and its of biblical proportion disastrous behaviors, and he took them head on. Upon returning from World War II, with a Purple Heart on his chest, a Black American hero is forced to kneel on the ground, a rope tying his hands behind his back, as two Klansmen with rifles stand over him, while Szyk demands, "Do not forgive them, O Lord, for they do know what they do," turning the statement of the book of Luke on its head. On the bottom of the original art, Szyk has added a second caption: "Each Negro lynching is a national disaster, a stab in the back to our government in its desperate struggle for democracy." And yet again, Szyk would do all he could to paint a visual history of the United States that is a tribute to this country, its growth, and its creativity, while presenting his ideal of an American people that is as inclusive as it is diverse. And toward that end, Szyk portrays America's contributions in the outer four corners of his visual history of the United States. And he shows this in the four corners of innovative factories and technologies. Here, the Hoover Dam at the top left, and at the bottom toward transportation of the steamship and locomotive. He acknowledges the power of its cities, of its people from coast to coast, of New York and San Francisco in the center on the sides, while celebrating in the four inner rondel vignettes within circular floral red wreaths those members of the armed forces who keep us safe, depicted here below as a white soldier and a white sailor, while at the same time, equal in size and space above, the Black man and the Native American are acknowledged and recognized by Szyk as essential components, as belonging equally within the overall fabric of America. All this, keep in mind, in 1945, by an immigrant who challenges his viewers to consider then and now as to what picture we would draw of an America in our time. To whom else might we look to illuminate the importance of an all-inclusive American people, but to the Polish Jewish artist, once so very new to America's shores, who nonstop fought on its behalf and the integrity of its citizens from the day of his arrival. On May 17th, 1948, this true patriot of American patriots became an American citizen, fulfilling his dream of at last finding the home that he had always searched for, and crowning the privilege he felt from the days of his first Collier's cover of being a future American. And how was Szyk rewarded? He was cruelly named as a subversive by the McCarthyites and the House Un-American Activities Committee, defamed by that same Congress who had welcomed him to America and decorated him with the George Washington Medal 15 years earlier. As a defender of liberal democracy, Szyk was cited in 8 instances as under investigation and or as a member of subversive communist organizations. He was listed by Senator Joseph McCarthy and UAC within the ranks of other falsely prominent immigrant citizen icons, such as Thomas Mann and Albert Einstein. And while it is impossible to imagine how exactly Szyk felt at this betrayal, humiliation, and pain laid upon him by the adopted country that he loved, it is absolutely clear as to how he responded. That is, with the same fierce moral clarity that drove him his entire life. And how did he respond? In 2 ways. First, by attacking his enemies with a strength and courage and conviction that he would always do. And secondly, by reinforcing and doubling down on the positive virtues and principles for which he believed America stood. First, going after his accusers, he would not be silenced. 2 men in casual conversation make farewell comments about the former Attorney General Tom C. Clark, concluding, "He is under investigation. His blood is red and his heart is left of the center." To think of it, we are all in trouble. Yet Szyk's most important response to the McCarthy era and its blight and contagion of fear on America would be that which would be his most long-lasting, his most enduring, that is, the creation of his greatest illuminated Americana. Painted in 1949, the very year in which Szyk was named by UAC, his Bill of Rights were an affirmation of the individual rights of protection for the citizens of his country. His Four Freedoms prayer, created the same year, expresses the diversity, unity, and liberty that Szyk sought for America, with the Madonna and Child receiving the 3 wise men, the white man, the Black, and the Jew, who offer a newborn country 3 gifts, symbolized by the gold box on which is inscribed the pursuit of happiness, life, and liberty. And finally, the capstone of a life's work is born in Szyk's illuminated text in 1950, the year before he died, of his magnificent Declaration of Independence, now appropriately housed at the Library of Congress. On July 4th, 1950, more than 300 people gathered on Independence Day in his adopted hometown of New Canaan, Connecticut, on the steps of its town hall to celebrate Arthur Szyk, his painting, and his love of America. The New Canaan Advertiser reported, Szyk given great ovation at July 4th ceremony. The chairman of the event called him one of the world's great free men who has dedicated his life and his art to the preservation of freedom. At the bottom of his illumination, Szyk had added his own dedication. To my fellow Americans, I dedicate with love this immortal heritage of our forefathers. May these words live in our hearts forever and ever, and for no good man loses his freedom, but with his life. Szyk admired the American presidents, Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln. And in the last year of his life, 1951, he illuminated these words among his final, which were most likely his mantra from the very beginning of his life. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. This was the artist activist, the liberator, the freedom fighter, the patriot of the people, Arthur Szyk. And this was the man, the builder of bridges between nations and peoples, who eliminated the words of Wendell Willkie's Fabric of America, with which I conclude. Our way of living together in America is a strong but delicate fabric. It is made up of many threads. It has been woven over many centuries by the patience and sacrifice of countless liberty-loving men and women. It serves as a cloak for the protection of the poor and the rich, of the Black and white, of the Jew and the Gentile, of foreign and native born. Let us not tear it asunder, for no man knows, once it is destroyed, where or when man will find its protective warmth again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irvin, for that. I think if you want to stop sharing your screen, we're going to move into audience questions. So thank you so much for that lecture, and thank you for, I know that was a lot of information, so we really appreciate it. For all of you who are watching, feel free to continue sending in questions. But I do want to start with, I know that Szyk died in 1951, as you just said, but was he involved in the early civil rights movement in any other ways than through his art?
No, only having died then in 1951, having created so many works to advocate for the Black man in the 1940s, you know, he was sort of well ahead of the civil rights movement in what he dared to do. I mean, for someone in 1945 to have painted the visual history of the United States, for example, and to feature a Black man as the Native American, you know, equal in size and dimension as the, you know, as the white soldier, for example, you know, it is remarkable that he was willing to take a stand, say what he believed, because he had moral clarity about what he thought was right and what was wrong. So in answer to your question, that was his civil rights art. And by the way, Szyk once was interviewed, I may have mentioned this in my first talk, I think, But in 1942, when no, yeah, in 1942, he was interviewed by a newspaper that asked him that if he, and again, I mentioned this before, that if
Mhm.
he didn't have to worry about fighting the war abroad and worrying about rescue of European Jewry, what would he be doing with his time? And Szyk responded, well, I would devote my life towards the advocacy for the black man in America, sort of paraphrasing what Szyk said. So clearly he, believed in an advocacy for human dignity for everyone.
Thank you so much for that. So another question that has come in is, and I think we talked about this a little bit in the first class, but perhaps for people who weren't there or haven't had a chance to watch the video yet, who were Szyk's contemporary influences on his art?
Yeah, well, that's really a great question. We can everyone and no one. There were, I mean, of course, he was in school in Paris as a teenager, at the Académie Julienne, and so you would think there would be teachers there who would have influenced him. But the problem was that in the 3.5 years that he was there, he was only went to 12 classes.
Mhm.
So it really wasn't there that he got his awareness of illuminated manuscripts and the technique which he pursued in 1920s Paris, an illuminator and medieval manuscripts at that time. You know, that's what attracted him, and it was the museums, the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Cluny, the and so on, that he went to. So we don't really know. We know the names of a couple of people. In Warsaw, he was exposed to a man named Aksentovich, who, but again, he was only sort of dropping in and wasn't there for very long. And so, we're much more aware of the people who influenced him in terms of his thinking rather than his art. Um, and I think what I mentioned in the first talk is that a man who's doing all the things that he's doing, in all the languages that he's able to write in Persian, in Chinese. I mean, who's teaching him this? His Hebrew calligraphy, we don't know who. I mean, he did go to one school that was founded by in Poland, but really didn't study art for very long, so we don't really know who his teachers were. The other puzzle, of course, is who were those who influenced him in terms of what his knowledge was of Judaism and Jewish life and Jewish people. But I suspect he learned most of that on his own, and maybe influenced by stories from his mom, from his mother, biblical narrative, and so on growing up. But we really don't know who his teachers were.
And so I think that actually leads into another question that came in. What was his early childhood education like, and what level of religious practice did he have in his as a child, and I think later in life as well? And did this impact his adult sort of view and advocacy at all?
Yeah. Well, it's said there's a story that grew up about this child prodigy that said that at age 6, young Arthur was already doing drawings of the Boxer Rebellion in China. Can you imagine a Jew in central Poland even hearing or knowing or being able to do that? But we know that he was sent to a trade school, and he was in trade schools, and then went outside of Łódź to a town called Scares, where he studied briefly. But then he was thrown out of school for drawing pictures of the Tsar, and also he was participating in strikes as probably an 11 and 12-year-old. So he was very active politically as a young child. When he went off to Paris as a teenager, he was already doing satirical drawings about society and sending these drawings, critiquing it back to Łódź to be published in a newspaper. So he was always active politically from a young age. Where and how he assimilated all this information, I really don't know. What I do know is that his father's um, factory life. His father owned a textile mill, and so in a very international city as Łódź was, with Polish Catholics, German Protestants, Russian Orthodox and Jews. It was a very international city. And so perhaps people were coming through. Also, Lodz was also at the end of the Silk trade route, from China, one of the two end points for the trade route. So there were many people passing through Lodz. And so Szyk, growing up, wasn't a ghetto or shtetl Jew. He was part of the middle class, upper middle class, and he probably read an awful lot. I know that when he was in America, he went to a lot of movies, and that's what he used to do. That's where he got a lot of information, and newspapers, of course, and radio. Yeah.
Thank you. So you mentioned HUAC and how he was brought before the House Un-American Activities Committee. But were any of his political cartoons ever censored from newspapers or magazines in the United States, either as a result of this or not?
Yeah. I don't know of any specific works. I mean, one could imagine that they were censored. But I don't know. I've not read anywhere or seen or know of any specific works that were censored. But do keep in mind that the drawing of the do not forgive them, O Lord, for they know what they do, of the black man with the Ku Klux Klan behind him. That I showed the newspaper clipping in which that appeared. So that was 1949. Of course, Szyk was named in 1949. He was never called. And, the result was, Szyk had a pretty weak heart. He had a couple small incidents beforehand, but, who knows whether the direct stress of the investigation by the committee, led to his another heart attack and his death in 1951, at age 57. So.
This might be a little bit of an easier question. What are the dimensions of Satan Leads the Ball and For Freedom's Prayer?
It's a great question. First, let me answer For Freedom's Prayer, one of the works shown at the very end. That's probably about, let's see, I don't know, 7 inches high by 5 inches wide. All of his works were watercolor and gouache, pen and ink, always on paper. Szyk never worked with oils, never worked on canvas. Satan Leads the Ball. Its location is unknown. I don't know where it is. The reason we're able to show it and that it's been reproduced is because in the Arthur Szyk archives, there was a 8x10 transparency that we were able to reproduce, for the exhibit at the Holocaust Museum in 2002, where they created there a blow up that was about 30 feet long. Now, how large is the original artwork? I can guess because there are 2 other works that are similar to that, and both of those works are about 10, 12 inches in width. So give another inch, maybe 13 inches, 12 inches to the width of Satan Leads the Ball, and its height, my guess is probably 5, 6 inches, maybe. And so that's the size of the artwork, and yeah.
Gotcha. And I think you mentioned, in our last lecture that, he worked on basically exclusively like smaller pieces, right?
Well, and sometimes he also used colored pencil, but he was a miniaturist. The largest work, which I have showed in this presentation, was his Declaration of Independence of the United States, and that's it's a little over 2 feet in height. And so that's among his largest. The Wendell Wilkie's Fabric of America also is pretty tall.
And actually, that leads to another question. Was his Declaration of Independence commissioned, or was it something that he just decided to do on his own?
He just decided to do it on his own. He left instructions to his son George that he wanted to see this appear in every office building and every school in America, and that he hoped someday, in 1950, when he finished the Declaration, he wrote to his son that he someday hoped that it would go to the Library of Congress. And actually, in the year 2000, in conjunction with the Arthur Szyk exhibition, Artist for Freedom, at the Library of Congress, the Declaration of Independence was gifted um, to the nation's library. And so, but Szyk had hoped that someday it would be distributed throughout the United States, and then that's where it ended up. But he was not commissioned. He presented it. He honorarily presented it to the people of New Canaan. So it's sort of like could be called the New Canaan edition of the Declaration, if one wills. But it was, and then of course this July 4th ceremony was held. You know, the Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, marching band, people turned out in festive celebration to, celebrate, this great American patriot. But it was not commissioned. I can tell you that during his lifetime, he actually valued this piece at $300,000. That is in 1950. Probably more than it was worth in 1950, but that's how Szyk saw it. And he wrote this in a letter to his son, George, about its value.
Well, that's actually an excellent segue into the next question that came in, because you just mentioned his son. And I think in our last lecture, we talked a little bit about his daughter, who I know you have a relationship with. What is his son up to these days?
Well, he's not doing much these days. In fact, he died quite a long time ago. He, after the war, he came to the United States. He was had a girlfriend or partner from France, and they were living here. He had hoped to what they did start, he and Arthur Szyk's wife, his mom, started a publishing company, New Canaan Art Publishing Company, with the idea that they would continue to promote his father's works. But Szyk died in 1951, and shortly thereafter, in the 1950s, George, his son, died. And so, this is, and in fact, that's the art publishing company never really took off because Julia, Szyk's wife, couldn't really handle this herself. And so the attempt to keep her husband alive, they had also dismissed all the dealers who were working with Szyk's art because they hoped to do this through the New Canaan Art Publishing Company. But with George's death, Julia could not continue that. And so you had no dealers and no family actually keeping Szyk's artwork alive in the marketplace. And to follow up that, Julia needing some money, well, maybe whether she did or she did, I'm not quite sure. But beginning in 1959, there were 4 successive sales every 2 years, 50, 59, 61, 63, and 65 at Park Bernay. And over 300 of Arthur Szyk's works of art were all sold off at public auction. And there wasn't any more art in the marketplace. So no dealers, no family, no art. That may be in part an answer to some people who've asked the question, whatever happened to Szyk's art, or this is a very small part of it, but I wanted to sort of mention this as well.
Thank you. So I think that also you just mentioned that for a while Szyk's art was not on the market, and maybe that was one reason why he's not as well known as some other artists. But do you think that HUAC and him being in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, did that also contribute at all, or no?
It's hard to say. I really don't think so. People didn't forget Albert Einstein. I mean, look, Einstein is Einstein. People didn't forget Thomas Mann or Du Bois, or Frank Lloyd Wright, or, I mean, people just didn't forget them after. And Szyk was so famous. I mean, he was so well known. I mean, I hope that it's part of these lectures to show really how well he was known and well respected. So, I don't think so. I mean, he lost one commission that I do know of, but it wasn't as a result of the investigation. It turns out that he was commissioned to illuminate the New Testament, and by a group, and he was painting Jesus, and he made Jesus look like a Jew, and he was asked to sort of change the features in which Szyk had presented Jesus, and Szyk refused to do that, so the commission was dropped. But of course, that had nothing to do with the UAC investigation. That was just Szyk's own stance.
Gotcha. Thank you. So we talked a lot in this lecture about how Szyk addressed the racism against Black Americans, and it seems like also Indigenous Americans as well in some of his pieces. Did he ever address the racism against Asian Americans at all in any of his art?
Well, yeah, I mean, against
That like, did he
no,
ever
I
address
know, yes.
racism like that in America against?
Japanese, the internment of the Japanese during the war. The answer is not that I'm aware of. I do know that during the war years, because of the way in which the Japanese had were racist against other Asians, Chinese and Koreans and so on, that Szyk was quite an advocate for the Chinese during the war. So it really wasn't about Asians. For him, the Japanese were an enemy of America. He saw them as the Nazis of the East, but he did not address their confinement, within the camps here in the U.S. I think for a lot of reasons he was focused on abroad. Of course, he did focus on issues here in the U.S., as I mentioned in the talk, but it wasn't about Asians for him. It was about who was being oppressed abroad. And I know that because I had a letter that was given by one of the friends of China to Szyk, and they thanked him. He actually, instead of donating his art to raise money for the Friends of China, he actually gave $50. Now, $50 in 1943 or 44, whenever Szyk gave that, or 42, that's a lot of money. But so he was constantly giving of his time, as he did. He was so engaged, but yet still had time, as I pointed out, to advocate for the Greeks, as he did, and the soldiers abroad from even Australia, New Zealand. He even created stamps for them to raise money. It was endless.
Thank you. And so this is actually something that came up in our last lecture, is the Ark at the Forest Hills Jewish Center. Can you talk about how we talked about what's going to happen to it right now, but can you talk about how that came about, him creating that Ark?
Yeah, Szyk became very involved with the Forest Hills Jewish Center. In fact, he arrived in America in October of 1940, and by February of 41, so October, November, December, within 4 months, his first exhibition in America, which was of his original art of his Haggadah, took place at the Forest Hills Jewish Center. So he already was connected to the center really only a few months after he was here. And he was introduced to them by a member of that congregation, Herman Jaffe, who was also very involved in helping Szyk, publish his United Nations series, his Visual History of Nations series, prints and other stamps that Szyk was involved with. So he had a connection there, and he had a connection then to Rabbi Ben Sion Boxer, who was the rabbi of Forest Hills Jewish Center in the 40s. And so I think the commission, or the whole idea, was that Herman Jaffe probably was connected to the rabbi to the extent that they began to explore the creation of this ark. Now, Boxer had to serve in the military, and so he had a young assistant named Jack Pressman, Rabbi Jacob Pressman, who later went to Los Angeles and lived a good long life with his wife Margie. And I met with Rabbi Pressman, and he spoke with me about he worked with Szyk on some of the symbolism, if you will, that Szyk was employing. Now, Szyk created his own artwork, his own original pen and ink drawings of what he planned to do, but they had conversation about that ark. And so it came about and was dedicated in 1949 when the new building was established, and that this ark was designed to was one of the few arcs that were being created in America that were sort of reflective of the old country, where things became more modern and more contemporary. Here, Szyk's arc served as a bridge between the old country from which he had come and from Europe, and served as a bridge between that world and the new world that would be built by Jews who were immigrants to America here. And the Forest Hills Jewish Center, sort of being a flagship conservative synagogue in America at that time, seemed just like the perfect place to create this monument really to his people. It's towering and impact.
Thank you.
I hope that gives some more background to it.
Yeah. So we're gonna go back a little bit to his family life. Did he have any relatives who were artists? Or was he kind of the only artist?
He was. He did. There weren't. I mean, later in life, his daughter painted. Alexander painted a bit. But no, his father ran the textile mill. His mother had been was from Russia. She with Salomon Szyk came to live in Łódź. His father established the factory. But you have to remember, there's lots of colors that are passing through this textile mill. There's lots of designs that Szyk is exposed to, but not aware of any other artists in the family. And his father had to be convinced to be willing to send Szyk as a teenager off to study in Paris, where he went in 1910. He was a 16-year-old, and because his father probably would have liked to see him continue in the family business, but I think the father was still more open to the influence of those in the community who said, this boy has talent, allow him to go off. And so as a 16-year-old, he goes and enrolls in the Academy Julienne, and studying there and meeting fellow students. Diego Rivera was there at the time, Jacques Lipschitz, other well-known artists who he had contact with in the teens when he was studying there. But no one else in his family. You notice you asked a question, I keep going beyond it, but anyway.
No, it's good. It's great. So another question that came in is how fast did he work? Like how long did it take him to complete a piece?
Wow, that's a question I'd love to answer. And we saw the work of art. I wonder if I could bring it back on my screen. Oh no, I'm not sharing now. I can't. But try to picture.
Reshare your screen if you want to.
I could, because this is I think a neat story. And if I can share this, let's see. Okay, can you see on the screen the visual history of the United States of America? I can tell you how long it took Arthur Szyk to do this work of art. And from this, one can, which is very complicated work of art, and from this one can get an idea of how fast he worked. Now, I have to tell you how I know this, because how I know how fast he worked. I once met a man named Bernard Gittleson, and Bernie was Szyk's agent in 1940s. And while he was his agent, I showed commercial art that Szyk was commissioned by big businesses and by magazines, newspapers. Bernie was one of his agents. And on one occasion, a man from Canada, a stamp dealer, came to see Arthur Szyk, and Bernie greeted him. And the man said, I'd like to have Arthur Szyk do covers for stamp albums for me. That is, if people were collecting prints that could be used as frontispieces in stamp albums. So if you collected the stamps of Canada, you would have a print of the visual history of Canada that would be the first work you would see in that stamp album. Likewise, the United States of America collected American stamps. Szyk would create this work of art, which he did as he did, and then it was reproduced. But so what happened was Bileski came to Gittleson, and he said to him, I'd like to commission Arthur Szyk to create these title pages. What would Arthur Szyk charge to do this. And so Gittleson went back into the room, the back room. He saw Szyk, says, I have this man outside, and I'd like to, how much would you charge him to create this visual history of the United States, for example? And so Szyk told him $1,000. So Gittleson went back out to saw Bolesky, and I just spoke with Arthur Szyk, and he wants $5,000. And he told me the story. And then I said and then Gittleson told me, and he paid it. And later Gittleson realized that he was really smart about what he did, but that's another question. But I asked Gittleson, I said, how long did it take Arthur Szyk to create this work of art? This specific work of art, how long did it take him? And Gittleson said, well, it took Arthur Szyk 1 week. 1 week.
Wow.
Which meant that how many preliminary drawings could you have done for this? You couldn't. You really took the board, you took the paper or the thick board that you were working on, and you went to work on it. Now, there's another part B to this story. What I didn't tell Gittleson is that a few months before, I went to Winnipeg in Canada, and I went to meet with Mr. Bolesky. And when I was with Bolesky, I asked him, I said, Mr. Bolesky, I know you had commissioned this United Nations series. Can you tell me something like, how much did you really pay Arthur Szyk for that work of art? And Bolesky told me, well, Irv, the truth is I knew that Szyk only wanted $1,000, but I paid him $5,000. And he said, I was okay with that. I said to him, well, tell me, how long did it take Arthur Szyk to do this work of art? And he said to me, well, see, Irv, that's the thing. He says, I couldn't believe I paid $5,000 for this work of art, and I got it back in less than a week. So here you have Szyk's agent, here you have the buyer, both tell me. So how fast did Arthur Szyk work? 1 week on the most complicated works of art. Okay, so give a nudge to Satan leads the ball and say, okay, maybe that took him 10 days instead of 7. I don't know. Maybe it took him 5.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, so I'll stop sharing, but that's the piece that gives us some idea of how fast Arthur Szyk worked.
Mm-hmm.
He did not use a magnifier. I may have mentioned this in the question and answer the first one, but he had one at his desk for other people to look close up. Yeah.
Wow. That's pretty mind-blowing, actually. So I think we are coming to the end of our time. So I apologize if we weren't able to get to your question, but I do want to ask just a couple more before we end. And I'm going to rephrase this one a little bit. It seems like Szyk, because he was an immigrant, was able to kind of see America more for what it is than people who were born here, perhaps, and was maybe able to kind of see what we could be as well. Do you think, would you agree with that, or do you think something?
I would agree, and I think, as you probably saw in this presentation, what I was trying to do was to move between both, between seeing America as a land of great possibility and a land of reality with its problems, that Szyk was both able to call attention to, as I said, like these 2 points of attack with regard to both abroad and here. Here he had 2 points of attack, which was to advocate for America and yet call it out where he saw what he thought were its injustices. And as we know, the reason Szyk has this, ability, I mean, I don't even think I have to say this, but, it's like, he said when he was creating his art, I create my art for permanence. See, I believe that, Szyk believed that somehow, some way, people would be discussing his art, more than 7 decades after his death. And because why would he create the art in such detail? I mean, because he only had to create something very quick to respond to the immediacy of the hour, but he really poured every ounce of his, his heart, his right hand, his mind into what he was doing. And he did and he could do it so rapidly. So we're blessed with having so much of his art.
Thank you. And so before we wrap up, I do want to we were talking before that really this lecture is kind of what does Arthur Szyk teach us about America today? Like what does he still have to teach us? And I'm wondering what that answer is for you.
Well, I think the answer is in the artwork that you know that we saw, and the words that he had to say, when he was being quoted in Answer magazine. And I mean, I think Schick's ability to cut through everything and to see things with the as they are, um, enables us to have someone, or at least the art, or the possibility of of realizing that there's not someone's art to lead on and not a person. That would be corny. But in a way, there are the evils that exist in society, which have always been have from the past. They're always going to be with us, and they need to be addressed in all places at all times. And I think that's what Schick's art does. It allows us to be able to recognize that what we see has happened in a different degree at a different time and place. And Schick called attention to that with the idea that his artwork would be eternal, because the problems with society, or those evils, are also eternal. So they need to be confronted, as he did in his own time, with the hope that we can learn something from it for our own time.
Thank you. So maybe you can give us a little bit of a preview for our next
Man,
class.
I can't. I'm like a horse at the at the gate. I can't wait. And I really wanted to give this talk because this was really important. I think before talking about anti-Semitism, about World War II and Jewish rescue and the creation of the Jewish state through Arthur Szyk's art, I think that we had to talk about America and the context in which he was creating so much of this art. And so now we see all that's going on in his life, all of his commitments, where he is. Now in the next presentation, we'll be able to focus on Szyk as an advocate for the rescue of European Jewry, as an advocate against anti-Semitism, as someone who lived through it and experienced it in his own life, um, and was able to serve as a fighting artist, and as a fighting artist for his own people. So that's what we're going to see at our next talk.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Irvin. This has been really informative, just as the last class was. And I hope that all of you out in the internet verse will join us for the rest of the classes in the series, which are happening every 2 weeks until April 8th. We have also added an in-person session on April 4th, so you can come meet Irvin in person and ask some questions and see how tall he is in real life. And
I end right here.
yeah, yeah. And we also so you can sign up for the rest of these classes at the link in the chat. If you enjoyed tonight's class, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support.